Commodus is remembered as one of ancient Rome's worst emperors, but thus far, it's not like we've seen anything exceptionally bad in our story. In fact, if we look at even some of the so-called good emperors, we could say that incidents from their lives look much worse than anything we've seen from Commodus. What's the big deal? And if you said that, I think you'd be right. There is actually nothing that exceptionally bad about Commodus thus far. The change seems to have occurred after the death of Cleander. And this is something that tends to be lost, even in some treatments of Commodus that are written by professional historians. There is, in my view, a distinct difference between the Commodus we see up to the middle of AD 190 and then Commodus in the final few years of his life. So why is it then that Commodus is remembered as such a bad emperor? We'll talk about that on this episode of the Pax Romana podcast. Episode 57, The Curse of Commodus. Hey listeners, before we get into our main material for the day, I just wanted to say thank you very much for supporting the podcast. The number of listeners continues to go up and up, so thank you for telling your friends, posting links to episodes, doing those sorts of things to help get the word out about the show. I don't make any money on the podcast, it's just something that I do for fun, and I'm very grateful for the positive response. So thank you very much. Let's get on to today's episode. As I said in the introduction, something changed for Commodus in the 190s. Historians to this day don't know exactly why he changed. From my investigation into the sources, I have my own pet theory. It is speculative, as indeed are all theories about why Commodus changed, but I'll put it in front of you anyway, and you can tell me what you think. One of the things that we read in the sources about Commodus, and this includes from Cassius Dio, who was basically the same age as Commodus and was around him often. Cassius Dio claims that Commodus, as a young person, was a coward, nervous, riddled with anxiety. And this makes sense if you think about the age in which Commodus grew up. The Antonine Plague was raging when Commodus was a child. He lost virtually all of his siblings to causes that we still to this day don't know what they were, but I imagine it was a mix of sickness and accidents and just unfortunate circumstances. The reality is infant mortality was very high in ancient Rome. So Commodus survived childhood, which was actually rare in his family. His father, Marcus Aurelius, and his mother, Faustina, they had perhaps 12 children, and only 2 of them make it into adulthood. We're also told by Cassius Dio that Commodus had these secret hobbies. They weren't necessarily in and of themselves terrible, and in fact, they're very understandable for a teenager. He liked to pretend to be a gladiator. He obviously valorized fighting in the arena. Commodus would be taken with his father on campaign when Commodus was a teenager, and he became interested in fighting. He was not, however, militarily inclined whatsoever. His father wasn't either. So if Commodus did have actual training in fighting, he never really used it in battle. So instead, he just pretended, and it was kind of a secret habit of his. The other thing that he did is he would go and race chariots. We're told by Cassius Dio that he did this by moonlight, again, so that nobody realized that he would do it. Now, why would he be so secretive about these things? Well, it was a major social taboo for any elite Roman, especially the heir to the empire, to be engaging in activities that are fit for slaves and low-born people. Gladiators are slaves. Chariot racers are not usually slaves, but they are low-born. And what they're doing is just appealing to a crowd, which is not consistent with Roman aristocratic values. Roman aristocrats rule. They do what is necessary. They do not follow the whims of the people. We don't know if Marcus Aurelius knew about these secret habits. He probably did, but maybe he thought that they were just the innocent explorations of a child, and there's no reason for him to think otherwise. And so he allowed Commodus to do this. We don't know. We don't have Marcus Aurelius's opinion about these things. I also wonder the extent to which Commodus even was able to make friends. From a very early age, he was clearly the emperor designate. He had to spend his time, I'm sure, in philosophy, going through the education and advice and preparation that was necessary for the burden that was going to be thrust upon him. And it was thrust upon him early. Marcus Aurelius, even before he died, made Commodus full emperor along with him in AD 177. Commodus was still a teenager at that time. So I mentioned these things: the cowardly disposition, the secret gladiator fighting and horse racing, a natural fear of sickness, and a life so occupied that he probably did not have much social interaction with people of his own age. We have in Commodus a person who was so sheltered that I have to imagine that he was a pretty fragile person. He would have had no idea not only who his friends were, but perhaps even what an actual friend looks like. He would not have developed the kind of internal set of bearings that most well-adjusted people have to be able to navigate a complex and frightening world. And he was the emperor. I think the year AD 190 flipped something in this person, this quite damaged person. And that is this: Commodus had survived. He had survived childhood illness. He had survived his sister's plots, the betrayal of the Senate. He had survived this epidemic in 190. He survived the riots and the mob even banging on the door of his house. He had survived the supposed plot and insurrection of Cleander. Again, the blame for that is misattributed, but in Commodus's mind, that didn't really matter. He had survived what was essentially a coup. In a way, Commodus had defied death itself. And I believe that the notion might have crept into Commodus's mind that he was somehow especially protected, that he may have even had some spark of the divine in his living body. Other Roman emperors thought that. When we talked about Trajan in episode 31, we saw an emperor who may have thought that he was a living god. And obviously some of the bad emperors seem to think this as well. Caligula, for example, who we talked about in episode 12. Now, the question for Commodus was, which god was he? Or which divine essence had been, in effect, kind of reincarnated in him? Well, it would have been a figure who survived many deadly trials. And if you know anything about ancient mythology, one name probably comes to mind, and that is Hercules. Hercules endured 12 trials, and he was the son of Zeus. For the Romans, the Greek god Zeus was analogous to their chief deity, Jupiter. Jupiter was seen by many emperors as their personal protector. So it would make sense for Commodus to think of himself as a son of Jupiter. And again, Hercules was also a son of Jupiter. And Hercules, because of his victory in one of his trials, had acquired a lion's skin, which was invulnerable. It could not be pierced by arrows. So Hercules wore this protective skin around. Also in mythology, plagues come in the form of arrows shot from Apollo. And Commodus had survived diseases now numerous times in his life. I think there are enough mythological connections here that we can understand what Commodus may very well have been thinking, that he was a reincarnation of Hercules. It may not surprise you to learn that from the middle of 190 onward, Commodus begins using the name Hercules. A gold coin, for example, minted in AD 190, shows on the reverse, which is the tail side of the coin, Commodus sacrificing to the gods with the title, the Herculean Commodus. We also have a statue which survives and is on display to this day in Rome, which shows Commodus as Hercules. He has the club of Hercules, he is nude, and he has the lion skin worn over his head and back. It is an exceptionally well-preserved statue. You should look it up. It's called the Capitoline Bust of Commodus. Now, it was not enough for Commodus to just claim that he was invulnerable. He had to prove it by means of combat. And so suddenly this closely guarded secret of his gladiatorial fights, became public. Commodus decided to begin fighting in front of thousands of Romans in the arena. Now, you might think that this means that Commodus was muscular and tough, and he fought real gladiators in real battles with real stakes. That is certainly the impression that Commodus wanted to give. In reality, when we read the source material, again, especially Cassius Dio, the senator who lived through this era, The picture that emerges instead is of highly choreographed performances, where Commodus was protected and allowed in many ways from a distance to slay animals that were drugged or otherwise incapacitated. For example, Commodus fought 100 bears, which sounds impressive. In reality, what happened was a bridge was constructed over the arena where Commodus shot arrows into a sea of bears below him. He really could not miss. Eventually, exotic animals were put in the arena. They were tied down or put in nets or drugged, and Commodus would walk through and kill them. He was basically a butcher. There was nothing about this that was brave or heroic. He then was given larger animals to kill: hippopotamuses, elephants, rhinoceroses, even a giraffe. And while he walked through the arena doing this, Cassius Dio tells us that the senators were forced to chant these words, quote, "You are master and first and the most fortunate of all men. A victor now and forevermore you shall be. Amazonian, you are the conqueror." We also know from inscriptions that Commodus was routinely referred to as Dominus, or master, around this time. Eventually, Commodus the gladiator graduated to human beings, and the rules of the game were obvious. The gladiators were to let Commodus win, and he usually spared their lives. When Commodus did murder humans, they were people who were sick or disabled that his minions rounded up and then put in the arena for Commodus to murder. We're told that on one of these occasions, Commodus used a club, again, like Hercules. And the idea here is that these people with disabilities, people who are missing legs or hands, they had lost them in an accident or they had lost them to sickness, were some kind of monster. Of course, I think it's clear at this point that the real monster in the arena was Commodus. So all this was happening from 190 to 192, just a couple of years. It must have been sudden and jarring to many senators. They were clearly blindsided, and this may have led them to participate in what was happening. Cassius Dio admits that he chanted like everybody else. He sat and watched the emperor in these spectacles like everybody else, but you can sense the resentment in his writing. And you can also sense Cassius Dio's feelings that what was happening was totally absurd. As Commodus was doing more and more in the arena, he also became increasingly eccentric and megalomaniacal. Commodus renamed the imperial palace the Commodian Palace. He renamed the Roman legions. They weren't Roman legions now, they were the Commodian legions. He renamed the Roman Senate as the Commodian Senate. He renamed the city of Rome Commodiana. And he took outlandish titles for himself. We heard one in the senator's chant, Amazonian, which references Hercules, who was victorious over the Amazons, these warrior women. He also called himself Invictus, which is invincible. In fact, he stopped using the name of his father, Marcus Aurelius, and he took all of these new titles and more and named each month of the year after his many names and self-appointed titles. So he removed the names of the old gods, including emperors like Julius for July, Julius Caesar, and Augustus for August. So we see in Commodus this frightened boy cowering and hiding, suddenly flipping and doing the exact opposite. He clearly had no sense of what it was like to just be a normal, well-adjusted person. He knew he wasn't going to be a coward anymore, but for him, that meant descent into complete megalomania. As you can imagine, these antics were seen as highly provocative by members of Rome's nobility, but the Roman Senate had not had a reason for generations to do anything about an emperor. They had had reasonably good emperors, and it seems like they may not have even been the ones who ultimately put together the plot that ended Commodus's life. In December of AD 192, 2 years after Commodus had turned into this monstrous person, the emperor began putting together a list of senators and other elites that he would kill at the beginning of the new year. Supposedly, this list included the names of several of his most intimate friends and advisors, perhaps even his mistress, a woman named Marcia, who had been with him for years. And so as Commodus got drunk on New Year's Eve, Marcia decided to take matters into her own hands. Either she herself or someone working with her slipped poison into Commodus's food or drink. He ingested it, but he had drunk so much that he began vomiting partway through the night, and the poison had not taken full effect. Commodus went into his bath to recover, and it seemed like he was going to make it, like the assassination attempt had failed. At this point, an athlete, perhaps somebody that Commodus had trained with, ironically named Narcissus, decided to creep into the baths behind Commodus and strangle the emperor to death. Commodus found out the hard way that he was not a god. He could, in fact, die. And the outpouring of celebration among Rome's elites was almost overwhelming. We have supposedly a record of the Senate's decrees immediately following the death of Commodus. And they do not read like a kind of professional, measured statement about the death of the emperor. Instead, they have this almost cathartic quality, a series of chants and sayings. And I'll give you just a sample of it. It's quite long. Here's what the Senate supposedly said. Let the honors of the murderer be taken away. Let the murderer be dragged in the dust. The foe of his fatherland, the murderer, the gladiator, in the charnel house let him be mangled. He is foe to the gods, slayer of the Senate. Cast the gladiator into the charnel house. He who slew the guiltless, let him be dragged with the hook. On all sides are statues of the foe. On all sides are statues of the murderer. On all sides are statues of the gladiator. The statues of the murderer and the gladiator, let them be cast down. Let the memory of the murderer and the gladiator be utterly wiped away. That's found in the Augustan Histories account of Commodus's life. If these minutes are indeed the real minutes of the Senate, to me, as a person who's done a lot of research into plague and the social responses to pestilence, these chants read to me like curses against a scapegoat. They sound very much like the types of scapegoating rituals that we read about in numerous ancient cities across the classical world. In other words, I wonder here if the Senate were essentially expiating Commodus like a divine curse, as though all of the bad things that had been happening at the end of the Pax Romana could be attached to a single person. And maybe not all of them were Commodus's fault, but he would serve as the scapegoat and thus purge the city from contamination and divine wrath and usher in a return to the Golden Age. But as we will see in the episodes to come, that is not what happened, and things get much worse. And for all intents and purposes, the Pax Romana was over.
Thanks for listening to the Pax Romana podcast. For more information, including a list of primary sources and further reading, check the show notes. Music by Red Productions and Exocor. Follow Professor Colin Elliott on X at ProfCPE or email colin@paxromanapodcast.com. Listen to more episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or just about anywhere podcasts are available. Stay tuned for the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast.